the dark, lying on its side.
Alright, welcome back everybody to Repeal the 20th Century. Today we have a very special guest. We have Tho Bishop. Do you want to introduce yourself, Tho?
Yeah. Well, I'm an assistant editor for the Mises Institute. Before that, I was deputy communications director for the House Financial Services Committee. Been having fun talking about paleo-libertarianism and libertarian strategy. And yeah, great to join you.
Yeah. So, I mean, the big reason I wanted to have you on, Tho, is I think back at Mises University we had some great conversations about strategy and, you know, kind of playing the game of politics as libertarians, which I think a lot of libertarians are starting to open up to that idea. I think the whole point of the Mises Caucus actually is, at least in the Libertarian Party and even in the GOP Party, is that whole thing. So I kind of wanted to ask you, you know, what is the practical strategy that you are using personally for people who don't know?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things when we talk about strategy, one of there's value in looking at where we've had success in the past. And I think that there is this sort of belief within libertarian circles that libertarians have never had success in politics. And I think that that ends up lending itself to, you know, third party sort of appeals, right? Because if the current system has never provided success, then you want to work outside of it, all sort of stuff. And so I think there are historical examples of libertarian ideas being successful, and I think that there's value in understanding why those were. You know, one area in particular I've been looking at has been 90s politics, which I think has a lot of relevance in the modern political system in a variety of different ways. Interesting, even his interview with Bill Kristol, or his debate with Bill Kristol. You know, Bill Kristol, with Scott Horton, Bill Kristol talked about the degree to which, you know, events in the 90s shaped his current worldview. And I think if you talk to Scott Horton, I mean, his experiences, you know, everything that happened there between Waco and interventions overseas, I mean, that also kind of radicalized him. So it's very interesting how much of American politics was shaped in the 90s. And within that, you had the success of Ron Paul's 1996 congressional campaign, which was part of this paleo era where you had libertarians like Lee Rockwell, Murray Rothbard, very closely aligned with Pat Buchanan and the populist right. And again, I think when you see where that sort of movement is today, Tucker Carlson being perhaps the largest voice in conservative media, the success of Donald Trump, obviously, you know, I think that this obviously highlights opportunities for libertarians to, you know, try to understand why Dr. Paul was successful in the way so many others were not. Obviously, there's things unique to him, having him, you know, been in Congress prior, et cetera, but there's some value there. Because that was a very close election. It was not, here comes Congressman Ron Paul coming back to his district. He was running in a different seat. He was running against an established politician who actually changed parties at the request of Newt Gingrich. So he had a lot of backing by Republican establishment folks trying to make sure they did not have Dr. Paul back in. He still won, so that's important. But I think it's even more fun too is that you can go deeper back. Of course, as libertarians, we tend to be very nerdy, you know, very intellectually driven, right? And so you don't want it, and so I think that, you know, there's an appreciation there for history at times. And so if you go even further back, you know, you had there were interesting aspects of the conservative movement that Murray Rothbard was not a part of, with kind of the degree to which, you know, for example, Goldwater's campaigns sparked a whole bunch of libertarian interests, including Lee Rockwell. There's aspects of, you know, what made his campaign attractive to radicalizing certain people in the right direction in spite of bad foreign policy there. If you look before that, you got the old right, you know, which, you know, particularly between, you know, during World War I up to, you know, all the opposition that could mount against the New Deal. You know, libertarians were very small in number, had outsized influence in kind of this reaction to progressive overreach. And then if you go back even further, the Jacksonians, I think, is perhaps the most successful example of libertarian ideas succeeding in a national standpoint. And while I get, you go too far back and it starts looking like an alien world, and you think, how can, Andrew Jackson style politics have relevance today? I think the degree to which, again, populist appeals against corporate interests, um, the importance of having that sort of great man figure, which Jackson was. I think the Jacksonians kind of fell apart when you replaced Andrew Jackson with Martin Van Buren. Um, Martin Van Buren, I think, was the more ideological libertarian of the two by far, but like, you need that sort of figure in politics, and that Van Buren was not. And so that's, I think by looking at a historical, going nerdy on, these aspects of American history that I think are often overlooked in libertarian circles, I think that we can identify potential value as we address where we are at as a movement, as a people, as a nation, and how to interact with it as such. And I'm glad that there's a lot more interest in the subject more broadly, and now it's the time to refining some of the ideas out there to figure out what's the best way to proceed going forward.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Though something I see a lot of people put out as a criticism is that the most recent attempt at this strategy was with Ron Paul's campaign in 2008 and 2012, and people are like, well, he was stopped in his tracks. Fox News would leave him out of news reports. They would selectively try to get him out of debates. There was selective coverage, even though he was very popular, and they just did everything they could to stop him. And a lot of people see that as that working through the GOP is impossible for libertarians, because they'll just stop them at every road when they actually try to succeed. What would you say is the counter argument to that?
Well, I think it's ironic because it typically comes from Libertarian Party Mises Caucus sort of folks, and yet their entire example, so that they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to try to paint Ron Paul's experience in Republican campaigns as the negative, yet their entire justification for existing is following the model of Ron Paul. So either Ron Paul's campaigns were successful, not necessarily in a Ron Paul presidency sort of way, or they weren't. In which case, what are you doing, right? I tend to take the point of view that Ron Paul's campaign was a great success, and I think if you look at, again, the problem is that you have people that want to fixate purely on, presidential races, and I think that's stupid. I think it's a very silly way of looking at it. It's very childish. It's, I didn't get my one way, my way, and that's one big thing, and so so I'm gonna act like this is some great defeat. Whereas if you actually look at the moment, the PT Party movement obviously did not go to nearly the extent things wanted, and Congress itself in particular. We elected a lot of people that were interesting. Some of them were very favorable to Ron Paul. A lot of them had instincts that were more libertarian than your average Republican up to that point. We got rid of a lot of bad Republicans as well, which sometimes is a value in itself. The Tea Party movement failed because Washington is not something that can be changed from within in this regard, right? You had committee staffers that had more power than Tea Party elected freshmen, and so it is, it is what I mean. Again, the Tea Party still took down John Boehner. Like you had sequestration. Like if you want to find examples of little kernels of the Tea Party made a difference, you could find them.
Yeah.
Not as big as we'd like. But if you look at the state level, I think that you saw a lot more very interesting state candidates in a variety of different ways. You had Tom Davis, who was a state senator out in South Carolina, was wearing Murray Rothbard shirts. You had interesting 10th Amendment stuff going on throughout the country with the work of Michael Bolden, and the 10th Amendment Center has done different sponsored things. You had a lot of you have the map of the way the gun laws have changed. With a lot of growth in the last decade or so. So again, I think that you can identify significant political victories within the sort of era of the Tea Party movement, which Ron Paul was definitely a major part of it. But more importantly, though, is the fact that the GOP has also changed. The media has also changed. More importantly, the relationship between the public and the GOP has changed. And I think people act as if the Republican Party is this powerful monolith that dictates where the Republican Party goes. It doesn't. If it did, Donald Trump would have never been the nominee. He would not have been the president, and he would not continue to be the most powerful force on the right. And so when you have Republicans that no longer trust, or even trust less, the establishment of the RNC, even after Trump's own fingerprints on it now, that distrust in that system provides opportunities for for movements that recognize that the system does not deserve that trust. And so again, politics in 2021 is very different than politics in 2008 or 2012. And I think that by most measurements, with perhaps some discourse on the economic issues, all of the ways the Republican Party is different is to our favor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree with that for the majority. Like, one of the big appeals for me that the Mises Caucus had, and still has, to a greater extent, but I think, as it's gotten bigger, it's sort of fixated its tendencies back to some really bad libertarian tendencies that have doomed the Libertarian Party to what it is right now. And the appeal for me was that it was going to focus more on state and local stuff, because I really agree that that's the future of libertarian victory, is focusing on those local and state elections. I mean, my previous workplace, Young Americans for Liberty, just look at all the great work they've done with the Win at the Door PAC, getting Republicans who are Liberty Republicans elected to state, and they've made huge victories and swathing victories, more so than the LP has. And I think a lot of libertarians are still very cautious of the GOP just because of what happened with Ron Paul. But I think they're thinking about it in too linear of terms, of that I have to pick the LP Mises Caucus or the GOP Mises Caucus, when I don't see why they can't work together. Would you agree with that they could work together, or
No,
I think it's impossible?
it doesn't work that way in politics. I'm sorry. It does. It'd be
Okay.
because if you're a libertarian on the ballot and a Republican on the ballot, you're negative. You're running against each other. It's a zero-sum game. Now, some states a little bit different than that in terms of but I don't. There's nothing the LP Mises Caucus provides me, right? Like that's the whole thing. The libertarians act like the Republican, like the value to the Republican Party for libertarians is not that the Republican Party is the vessel that provides the value. The libertarian, it's just the libertarians trading upwards in that regard, right? It's like there's not some sort of large libertarian electoral base that if Republicans can crack that nut, it's going to dominate the landscape. No, I mean, it's asymmetric, whereas libertarians can have an outsized influence on Republican officials far more than libertarians can contribute to Republican officials. And so again, that's where the power dynamic is there. I do think the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus at its best served as a critique of the capital L libertarian brand, served as a fine mirror against some of the absurdities and the just the jokish individuals, the unserious folks that call themselves political libertarians. The problem is, of course, is that once you go from being a critique to being a governing coalition, you're no longer a critique, right? I mean, you've got the LP Mises Caucus day is full of the same losers that it was meant to critique. And I'm not saying all, right?
I mean, I agree with that.
The OGs, the OGs, but necessarily the large, anybody that joined the Mises Caucus, like the whole Liberty Unity thing with all these, with all these podcasts was popped up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
I get the desire for kumbaya and liberty unity, but the Mises Caucus was meant to, at its best, was a rejection of liberty unity. It was saying that we are going to push a pure Austro-libertarian Mises Institute style libertarianism, and if you don't like that, well, then we're going to take over your party. But if you once you embrace liberty unity, and you want to start attracting these sort of folks, well, then what's the purpose then?
Oh
And
yeah.
I don't fault them. Like obviously, this is naturally cool. Yeah, that was naturally going to happen if they prioritized taking over the LP.
Mhm.
You can't take, and what's the point of taking over a party and then stripping down an irrelevant third party to even smaller form? Like that's never what a political party was supposed to do, right? And so like it makes that pivot makes total sense, but it also makes the LP Mises Caucus totally useless. And so
Mhm.
now what the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus really is you have to do two parts. You have people that are Dave Smith fans, and I understand the appeal of Dave Smith a lot more than I understand the relevance or the usefulness of the LP Mises Caucus.
Mhm.
And so the LP Mises Caucus now simply becomes a means by which they can secure Dave Smith the nomination
Yeah.
in 2024, right?
Mhm.
But everything that they've said up to that point, oh, we're going to take over all these spots. Oh, we're going to get involved. Like as you mentioned, we're going to start focusing on state and local politics. Well, what does the LP Mises Caucus have to contribute? Libertarians interested in state and local politics. Oh, we've got a pact that we're going to donate. We're going to donate $1,000 to a campaign. Okay, fine. But the second it comes out, if you're running in Bay County and you're getting money from an LP PAC, then that $1,000 is a net negative because you're associated with an anti-Republican party,
Mhm.
right? So like
Yeah.
so get thinking about local politics and wanting to do good. Who cares?
Yeah.
It's the party itself is not the means to do it.
Mhm. So when I think about the ability of the LP Mises Caucus and the GOP Mises Caucus, working together, I think of it as so in New York we have a very interesting dynamic of how parties work. We have a conservative party, we have the
Yes.
Republican Party, and we have the Libertarian Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're a great example of how they work together,
Mm-hmm.
and how they work together is if the Republican Party candidate caves enough to their demands, they don't run somebody against them and they
Right.
throw them on their ballot.
Right.
Even in my local town, most of my mayor, most of my city council are on the LP ballot. They're on the Conservative Party ballot, and they're on the Republican Party ballot. And that's kind of what I think about it. Our mutual friend Marcel, who, if you guys don't know who that is, please check him out on Twitter. But our local friend Marcel, he explained it very well. Where the purpose of the LP should be, at least with the Mises Caucus, should be to say to Republicans, cave to our demands a little, and then if you don't, we will run a candidate against you and try to, spoil the election for you or whatever. And, you know, that tactic can work. It works here in New York, but the problem I think right now is that a lot of people are still being very partisan about I will vote LP and nothing else, and that's a problem. I think that's a major problem because if you're going to pass up a Liberty Republican running up because he doesn't have that L next to his name, you're in the way. You're somebody who is not helping liberty. You're in the way of liberty.
Right. I think theoretically that is a
Mhm.
model that can work. I've discussed the New York model in the past.
Mhm.
Um, the problem is that in practice we haven't seen any interest from the LP Mises Caucus of pursuing that sort of strategy.
Mhm.
Now, for example, again, the main goal of the LP Mises Caucus is to run a candidate against a Republican in 2024, the presidential election, as that is the ultimate priority to try to get who might be the most powerful speaker on these ideas out there right now. Again, Dave Smith is a good person for that role. But the goal is not to negotiate demands from a
Yeah.
Trump campaign or DeSantis campaign. It is to make your play there. Additionally, though, again, if this carrot and stick approach presumes that, for one, they have the weight behind them to make a difference in the first place, right? Which I don't. Yeah, it's always popular to blame third-party candidates after the fact. Shane Hazel's race in Georgia, for
Yeah.
example, among others. Um, I'm not too totally convinced of that. But two, you have to be able to provide a carrot.
Mhm.
And so, for example, if the LP party of Florida, if the LP Mises Caucus, actually, let's start there. The LP Mises Caucus was sincere in trying to do the strategy of pushing the GOP towards a more liberty direction. Then you would go to the LP of Florida, which I believe is an LP Mises Caucus affiliated state party, and you would tell them that you're going to endorse Ron DeSantis. And they will say, oh, but the bylaws. And then you would say, who cares about the bylaws? Rewrite the bylaws.
Yeah.
Right? And if you can't, then okay, then this entire thought experiment doesn't work, right? But you'd endorse Ron DeSantis, and you'd make a big deal about the fact that, hey, there's plenty of areas of disagreement. We hope to work closer more in the future. But, thanks to Ron DeSantis being governor, Floridians have had more liberty than anyone else in the world.
Yeah.
We're appreciative of that fact. And so he has our endorsement, for the 2022 election. I think Ron DeSantis' team would appreciate that endorsement. And that would show that the LP is willing to play, to pat good Republicans in the back. But if it's just, this idea that, we're going to complain about Republicans unless they do what we want, and then we're going to complain. You don't have that sort of relevance. So you've got to provide value the other way around. And I have not seen anybody in the LP remotely interested in providing value to the Republican Party. And that includes any leadership in the LP Mises Caucus. And so, again, theoretically, that would be a much more interesting use of the LP. The problem is, though, is that, again, there's other way. Is the LP in particular a vessel that is the best use of, of that? I'm not particularly sure. I mean, can the LP be used in that sort of way? Libertarians are not known for their socialization skills.
Yeah.
By nature, so I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah, I mean, so I went to the Take Human Action tour that they had in Fairfax, and great speakers. And I had spoken to Heiss for a while. I asked him, if there was a Liberty Republican running, like in a state representative race or like a local race, would you want an LP, just him being the founder of the Mises Caucus, would you want the Mises Caucus or the LP to run a candidate against them? And he said no, and I think he's open to that. I think the main problem here now is what you said, that when it became more about taking over the LP, and when it really kind of has, I mean, the rest of the LP is completely irrelevant now. It's pretty much just the Mises Caucus, people who are, really getting anything done or going to get anything done within the LP, that is. And, it let in some types that they were critiquing. I mean, Todd Hagapin, Libertarian in Chief on Twitter. Baby. Yeah, the boss baby. Not the one that shot somebody, the other one. But, yeah, I mean, when they let in these types, it became back to LP normalcy. I mean, like, even the whole getting Dave Smith as the presidential candidate really worries me about the future of the LP Mises Caucus, because the whole point was not to do this, to not, get all excited about one presidential candidate for the LP and be like, he's going to do so good, he's going to get us so many results in the presidential election, when the whole forwarding of the LP Mises Caucus is that at most the presidential candidate was supposed to be a messenger that would, trickle down ballot, like do work for down ballot candidates, get people excited for them, not the other way around, and not take all the resources, which is often what happens. Like Joe Jorgensen was taking basically all the LP money and all the fundraising away from other candidates who probably actually could have won a race, but then we had Joe Jorgensen, who cost, the New York LP their ballot access, cost a bunch of other states their ballot access, because she couldn't even get like 5% in most states.
Yeah.
So,
and
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I also think there's just a dynamic there where, again, you could have a candidate. The interest in a third party run goes down the more politics becomes polarized. Right? And so I think that, for example, the high watermark was the LP 2016 run. I understand the argument that it was a missed opportunity. I mean, ultimately, Gary Johnson did lose to Ron Paul in that race, even though Ron Paul didn't run. But it was a very successful, in terms of the vote count for the LP, incredibly successful. Part of that, I think it was Gary Johnson was seen as a serious candidate, but sort of people looking for a third option there, in spite of everything Gary Johnson tried to do to dissuade them of those views. But like, it was also because it was viewed that, Hillary and Trump were kind of equally bad. And I don't think I think there's far fewer people that believe that anymore. There's some that believe Trump is even worse than they thought, relative to Hillary. And there's some that, Trump either won over, or they're now convinced, understandably so, that the Democrats are literal satanic pedophiles. And so that tends to take away interest in a third party if you believe that. And so again, I look, if you're looking at a Kamala Harris versus a Ron DeSantis run, just to throw that out there, who's disinterested in between those two? Like, what libertarian would be? Oh yeah, if you're a libertarian saying that these two are basically the same, okay, I don't want to share a movement with you, right? Like, that's just it's crazy talk.
Yeah.
And so that's the other side of it, is that, again, they're trying to rerun 2016 in their heads. And I understand, you had an opportunity there, and I understand not being happy with the results, but it ain't 2016 anymore, guys.
Yeah, I agree that it is in 2016, and interest in the third parties is lower. I mean, 2020, proved that, even though, like, you can say, yeah, Jo Jorgensen was a weak candidate. She was, and she probably, if we had somebody else, there might have been a little more interest, but not that much.
But who else was running? Jacob Hornberger wasn't going to rally the mass. Like, a great guy, love him to death. But like, he's he wasn't going to be that guy either. Larry Shaw. So it is what it is. And that's the other thing too, though. The Mises Caucus had 4 years to harpoon a whale to run, right? That was the whole thing. 4 years, and they couldn't get anyone. So they ran the same candidate for chairman as they had before.
Yeah.
They couldn't get anyone to run. They got Jacob Hornberger as the best candidate they could get to run to be their candidate, and then who was successful was Spike Cohen, who was kind of a coalition candidate for the LP, which is great. I think Spike Cohen is the best representative the LP has.
Yeah, I agree with that.
More so than Amash, and in some ways just because he's been in the arena, and more so than Dave as a pure party candidate representative. And but Spike Cohen, I also don't think is a Mises Caucus original sort of guy either, right?
Yeah.
And so now like if which kind of goes to that previous point, and so but again, was Spike Cohen going to get would have Spike Cohen have done better than Jo Jorgensen? Given the environment, I really don't know. I guess there seems to be. I think there's an overly romantic sort of perspective of, because we've been fueled this crap for such a long time, right? Like, every year you get, it's I think they change turns on who writes the article, but it's either Cato or Reese that puts up things like, oh, well, the majority of Americans are socially liberal and physically conservative, and if only they recognized that libertarians were the people that gave all their freedoms all the time, or whatever the little line is.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work that way, because social tolerance is it doesn't really quite, like, when you actually talk to the real people, they're really they're not just one good recent article away from becoming a Cato donor. And there's this, you have this anti-politics, it's the Joe Rogan demographic and all that sort of stuff, and they're acting as if if only you got your average Joe Rogan listener familiar with libertarianism, they're going to see that it's the same, this this is the ideology for them. And it's like, if you're a Joe Rogan listener, you're already not listening to like mainstream political stuff. Like the idea that
Yeah.
your average Joe Rogan listener has never been exposed to libertarianism,
Is yeah.
I don't really buy it. Like, these are, like that's going to be the crowd that probably, I bet you Joe Rogan's audience base disproportionately voted for Ron Paul for anyone
Yeah.
of age than your average platform, right? So it's not like, oh well, if only these people that reject the Team Red and Team Blue, if only they hear our message, they know. Like the political behavior is just not as it's. Turns out people vote for who they think they're going to win more often than not. Like
Yeah.
it isn't some sort of profound demonstration of romantic political views that one has.
Hmm.
And again, a libertarian should understand this better than another. Like we should recognize that is not the way democracy works, and adapt accordingly.
Yeah, I think a lot of libertarians think that we need to like convince everybody. We need to convince or convince the majority to be diehard libertarians, but I don't think that's the case, and I don't think it will ever be the case that's achievable goal. And I think really, if libertarians are going to win, regardless of what strategy it is, the way to win is convincing them of an important position that leads downstream into the rest. So my opinion is that that position is secession.
Well, I think that definitely plays, given the broad attention to the topic, that's definitely, I think, a good focus, and that applies to a lot of states out there. And the other good thing, though, is that, again, libertarians can have outsized influence while being a small minority within a political movement. And, for example, a lot more important than than a candidate running for the LP presidential nomination is a libertarian getting on the Senate staff of Herschel Walker,
Hmm.
right? And again, that takes, a skill set, connections, working your way up, and then playing the game. That's a lot more practical.
Hmm.
And that's something that one person, if you had a Mason grad with a PhD,
Yeah.
a Mason PhD that did their undergrad in Georgia and has interest in public policy, well then, start working Republican rooms and see how you can get onto Herschel Walker's campaign staff, right?
Yeah.
Um, that we can have outsized influences, sort of thing. The most successful libertarian was Martin Van Buren, that got Andrew Jackson, who was less libertarian, to run, and then he was able to work himself around him. Like that's the, I think, the area that works best for any sort of genuine hardcore ideological movement generally. And again, it's something that can be done.
Hmm.
And the beauty of it is it's not democratic. You've got to pick the icon that can win in a race. That's why I like the Herschel Walker example. Very rarely do living statues run for Senate. But it's like you find a guy that's is a popular nice guy,
Yeah.
and then you put someone of strong ideology next to him. And is that going to mean that they're always going to listen to him? No, not necessarily.
Yeah.
I wish that was the case. But like that's the way you can actually make inroads here.
Hmm.
But again, though, that requires looking at libertarianism. You have to look beyond libertarianism as kind of a movement per se. And I think libertarianism as a movement very rarely works, because it's always necessarily trying to create this sort of third way approach to politics. Neither left nor right. I think that is always the most toxic aspect of, the most undermining aspect of that was trumps up libertarians. And I also think it's a reason why I've thought about this a great deal recently, is that you have some people like Dave Smith has used the term recently, Jack Hunter likes to use it, but it's libertarian populism.
Hmm.
And as someone who is a fan of the populist strategy and admirer of populist history, I used to think that it was a good term and a paid term. I not think it's I not think it's a negative one. I think it because it's a self-deluding one,
Mm-hmm.
because there is no libertarian populist. Um, because it never really works as just hostility to the state, because it tries to do so without any sort of cultural, backing. And so really, populism is about rallying the masses against their enemies, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the only reason you use the qualifier libertarian rather than right is precisely because you're trying to reach both the left and the right simultaneously. And then and I understand where they're coming from, right? You have there's always this very romantic idea, like, oh, well, you got the anti-war left and Christian homeschoolers with the Ron Paul movement, and look what happened, right? Or I've got my you personally might have won over some former left wing activists and some Tea Party conservatives, and now
Mm-hmm.
you're all Rothbardists. I get it. Anecdotally that works, but on a massive scale, you can't. What ultimately what actually mobilizes people is less economic policy. It's less the platform. It is concerns about it's cultural concerns. It is them feeling that their way of life is under attack by the other, and it's difficult, like, and I don't think you can do that by transcending whatever is the cultural norms that they're defending. And so again, you can't have you know trainees for liberty in a coalition trying to stop drag queen story hour
Mm-hmm.
at your local library. Even if let's say that the trainees for liberty were totally got where they're coming from, because like they don't like government, they might be okay with it, but like you're not, obviously it's going to be an instant turnoff from the sort of people that you actually need, right?
Yeah.
Because the number of people that are outraged at drag queen story hour at the local library is a lot larger than the supporters of trainees for liberty, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
and I think
you know
there's a unique opportunity to capitalize on that kind of stuff because, a lot of the mainstream conservative movements, I mean, like, look at TPUSA, for example, who are indulging in that kind of stuff, and it's creating a backlash.
yeah.
We saw that with the whole the Groypers or whatever,
Yeah, it's
and
easy to laugh at these. It's easy to
yeah,
laugh at Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, because you think that you're better than. I'm sorry, there's not a libertarian better than Charlie Kirk. Like, are you smarter than Charlie Kirk? But who cares? Charlie Kirk has more money than you do.
yeah,
Charlie Kirk has built a major organization that that gets him access to all the power brokers he wants to have access to on his
hmm
side of the aisle. Who cares that he hasn't read his human action?
yeah,
That's those sort of people you want as allies. You don't want to laugh at them because like it makes you feel edgy,
hmm
and because you have envy that a guy that you think is in your intellectual superior is having success that you can't even dream of. Like, that's not but unfortunately that's what often motivates a lot of this stuff in libertarian circles. And I mean, the entire LP strategy is based on the fact that we're smarter than these sheep. You should be voting for us, but you're not, because they're not smart enough to understand what we have to offer for you. Like that's the underlying zeitgeist of the political libertarianism.
hmm Yeah, and I agree. As much as I don't like Charlie Kirk and TPUSA, he has crafted something and he has created it. Though I think it's starting to diminish in its influence, mostly because of what you can't have a coalition that is trying to stop Drag Queen Story Hour and then have trannies for Trump, which
Yeah,
is the equivalent there.
yeah,
You have people
yeah.
like
Charlie
Lady
Kirk's way too
Maga.
libertarian. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the problem with Turning Point USA. They're far too libertarian.
yeah, yeah. Ironically, but we do have an organization, and that, not to sell them again, but Young Americans for Liberty
Yeah.
is crafting out that serve. But a lot of libertarians are still refusing to jump on that train, or at least should jump on some of their more effective trains.
Mhm.
That being Win at the Door pack, because they work with Republicans.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and good thing is you don't need those people. The problem, what concerns me with the Young Americans for Liberty, you've got a lot of great people there.
hmm
Eric Breaking has just walked the walk. Reed Cooley over there yeah, I really respect him a great deal. I think he's excellent, and the stagecraft of Yale Revolution's event this year was fantastic, top notch. But the problem is, though, is that their executive director is a libertarian,
Yeah.
and I don't, and so what concerns me is that here you have an organization that has now done a great job of winning elections. It doesn't matter, but has created their own liability. With the board allowing a libertarian to be a leader of your organization, it was such an astronomically stupid. If I was running against a Yale candidate, a Yale endorsed candidate, the first thing I do is to start pumping out my candidate has just been endorsed by a never Trump anti-Republican organization with this Texas LP person as the head of the organization.
Yeah.
Do you think they're going to defend Trump when they have an anti-Trumper as the head of the organization? And then you put a screenshot with him and Justin Amash. When Eric Brakey lost his congressional race, what was the highlight of the mailer used to destroy his campaign? It was Justin Amash and Eric Brakey. You had a candidate here in running for state house in 2018. Wonderful. Would have been the best person, one of the best people in the Florida State House. Like, give Anthony Sabatini a run for his money. She was penalized because they ran a mailer with her and Justin Amash. And so now you have what has been an extremely effective, important, perhaps the most powerful libertarian organization in libertarian political history that now has a dull as dishwater, contributes nothing person as the executive director.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's concerning. And so that's the sort of stuff that you're looking around, and it's like, does the LP Mises, and then they're retweeting Shane Hazel.
Yeah.
Why would a political group retweet somebody whose only relevance is pissing off Republicans and giving the Democrats a seat? Again, it's nothing to take away. Again, does Lauren Doherty, does she care about liberty? I have no doubt, right? I think she's a good person. Does the board think that they're doing the right thing by, we're going to promote a libertarian woman as the head of organization, and we're going to show that this movement is for everyone, and yada yada diversity? Fine, okay, I may have the best intentions in the world. It was Shane Hazel content that they tweeted as liberty as possible and show how edgy they are, and they're trying to attract 18, 19, 20-year-olds looking for something a little bit different than the Turning Point USA crowd. Fine, doesn't matter. Ultimately, the goal of the organization is to convince boomers to vote for your candidate in the Republican primary or the other candidate. And every single one of those things makes that mission harder, in spite of the libertarian impulses underlying, right? And so that's what concerns me. And again, it just comes to the problem where you have libertarians prioritizing the wrong things when it comes to politics and trying to make politics be something that's not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that is another.
So yeah.
That is another concern, is that libertarians don't have much in the way of prioritizing.
Does Yale want to be the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus? It's fine. It's not the downgrade. Like, they could do that. They could be a more effective Libertarian Party Mises Caucus. I think that's a downgrade. I'd rather see the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus try to be more like Yale.
Yeah, I do agree that it would be a downgrade. I mean, like, even I think a lot of people in the Mises Caucus would agree that that's a downgrade. At least a lot of the more OG people that I know, and I think some people do want to be more like Yale. And I think, yeah, I agree with you. I immediately had concerns with the executive director. I'm not gonna go into that whole situation that happened with Yale and Cliff Maloney, but as soon as that was happening, I was worried, because these are often opportunities for less savory members of your organization to subvert it. And I think that in some ways they kind of have. You know, I think she fails some of the even purity tests. Even if we were going to go, oh well, you know, she doesn't hold all the positions. She fails that too. And if she fails both the strategy and the purity test, what's the point? And I think that libertarians in general have a real hard problem about prioritizing goals and prioritizing what needs to be done. I think the best example is the whole COVID and you know, in Florida and other states banning personal vaccine mandates like for businesses. I think that's a real good example of prioritizing, you know, goals. A lot of people are like, yeah, well, it inhibits on a business's right to association. Well, guess what? We have a ton of those on the books, and the rest of those on the books, um, you know, aren't literally preventing people who would be, you know, sympathetic to your causes and goals from working, from being able to participate in society. You know, those things, those bans, you know, are just as bad or just as bad, but you got to think about the here and now. And you got to think about how these mandates are being enforced by, you know, corporations that they're not gonna go rally for libertarianism because you defended their ability to fire people who didn't get the vaccine. They're not gonna do that. They are gonna side with the state as they always have. And
Right.
the idea that you're protecting them doesn't help anybody, and it doesn't get anything done. Whether or not, you know, our principles say we should defend it.
Well, I think it's important to just engage with structures of power as they actually exist,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of the politics of wish fulfillment is something that I think plagues libertarians a great deal. Because what we have, what we want to believe is, oh, if we simply stand the line and are the strongest advocates of property rights in general, then we can click our heels together and we'll get a property rights environment. I don't think that really works. And so, when I look at, so all of the arguments that are used to bash DeSantis and at their most absurd try to genuinely, sincerely compare any state level issue, and they get Texas and Montana, there's other states that do this as well. But they seriously try to equate protections against discrimination of unvaccinated people with Biden's mandate forcing, employees to be vaccinated. It's a silly comparison. But we also have to recognize, again, like when you're living in a civil rights legal regime, then the business, we do not have a private property environment. You as a business, are not free to discriminate against X, Y, Z for a variety of reasons that the regime has said you can't do it. And so if libertarians, if those who are the most interested in property rights generally, when you have a government that is seeking to create a lower tier caste and to damage the lives and quality of life of dissidents, if we do not use the power of the states that we control to protect the civil rights of those dissidents, then we will have a regime where the only people it is allowed to discriminate, and that we're having a state that actively promotes the discrimination of political dissidents. And what do you think that is going to happen in the long term for political liberty and property rights and all that sort of stuff in the future?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have fewer political dissidents, right? You're going to have less wealthy political dissidents.
Yeah.
You're going to have less influential political dissidents because the system is set as such. And so to me, I think it is, I was having a debate with someone, he's a lawyer up in Pennsylvania, I respect a lot, a great guy, but he brought out the typical sort of refrain is that, well, I'm concerned about your logic of the ends justifying the means. And my perspective is that, well, I think the other side is equally troubling. The ends can disqualify the means. and so all of the libertarian arguments against attempts to protect the unvaccinated, protecting the rights of political dissidents in this country, that is a sure way of making sure that the end result politically, however this all ends up, is a less libertarian one.
Yeah.
Because again, like, the people that are the actual flesh and blood libertarian allies are the ones that suffer directly from this, and we can't, we can't sacrifice the people of our movement for an interpretation of the ideas of the movement. And it's something that, again, if you look throughout history, Ludwig von Mises, I do not believe would have said that there was no role here for protecting, libertarians. I don't think Murray Rothbard would have ever the way when they actually dealt with politics as it actually existed. They weren't trying to justify and thought process their way to sterility. Yeah, it was they were trying to identify ways of genuinely pursuing human society towards a greater path of liberty and standing up to, a biomedical tyranny state and the privatization of it. Again, I think the battle does become a lot more nuanced when we deal with small businesses and whatever, and I would be perfectly okay with some sort of carve out there or whatever. But we cannot, if libertarians continue to treat corporations, and this is true with the big tech issue, this is true with all others, if they continue to treat big tech issues as or the big corporate issues as equal to theoretical thought experiments and dealing with small businesses or other sort of things, then you're going to lose. Because government policy has directly led to the massive consolidation of corporate power in this country. Corporations are particularly vulnerable to the political diswill of the establishment. Every single incentive structure in its place to become toadies of the regime. Historically, we have seen this play out. And so again, if libertarianism in the 2020s is all about using examples of small businesses to defend every policy, to defend any attempt to restrict, corporate policies that are actively detrimental against life, liberty, and property of Americans, then that is a brand of libertarianism that is not simply not politically viable with a large percentage of the people. It becomes actively harmful to the romantic ideas that they're trying to sell.
Yeah. And on, Mises being, we would not be on these people's sides. I mean, just look at his situation in World War II. I mean, he allied himself with the fascist party for the purpose of that. His two other options were the Nazi Party of Austria, who wanted him dead, or the Communist Party of Austria, who wanted him dead. And he realized that there were some goals that needed to be fulfilled now at the cost of, other goals being fulfilled now. But he saw a future at which he could fulfill all those goals, and some of that meant that sacrificing some of those goals now. And I think even better example now is, people who everybody in the Mises Caucus loves, Hoppe. Hoppe now. Hoppe still works in Europe. Like, Hoppe is a big figure in Europe because he is able to work with right-wingers who, aren't full-on die-hard libertarians, but he gets libertarian goals satisfied. I mean, look in Poland. Poland has a government that isn't fully libertarian, or a right-wing party that isn't fully libertarian, but yet he still gets libertarian goals accomplished. And I think, a lot of people are, kind of ignoring the ideas and the experiences of the people that they, claim to admire, to love and trust. And I think that's like a very dangerous way to go about it.
I absolutely I agree on that, and I think that and that's also just where I think that libertarians would be better off just reading more history. history of the movement, history in general. You have a lot of libertarians that know a lot about history, but often it's kind of in a pre-chewed ideological narrative, which is fine. I mean, Rothbard has a lot of those. You know, Tom
Yeah.
Lawrence's books are great. Like, there's nothing wrong with reading your history from libertarian, but I think that there's even but it's also important to get your history from non-libertarians because, for one, it's good intellectually to identify, you know, smelling the rat, you know, where it is. Like, it's always good to try to identify where those biases pop up on other perspectives. But also, there's just a lot to learn, and I think that there often is this trap where libertarians kind of build their own libertarian ghetto. Um, uh, Both in terms of just social media and just general content consumption. So, like, if all you're doing is listening to libertarian podcasts, even great ones like this, if you're simply reading libertarian websites, if you're watching libertarian YouTube videos, if you're reading your history from libertarian writers, you know, that's going to make you a very strong, passionate libertarian. Like, and you know, for a lot of people, that's good enough. But, like, there are lessons that can be learned from drinking outside of that stream. And I think particularly with in terms of political strategy, and finding ways of making these ideas stronger, I think there's a tremendous amount of value out there.
I agree entirely, and I'm actually really glad you brought that up because something I've been doing a lot recently has been reading non-libertarian writers. One, you know, like I've been reading Lenin. I've been reading Hegel. I've been reading all these other people who are not libertarians by any stretch of the imagination, but they have things to teach libertarians, and I think one in particular is Hegel with the dialectic. It's called the master-slave dialectic, and it's the idea that society is a battle between masters and slaves, and the winners of the battles are the slaves who are willing to, you know, give up everything. They are willing to give up their principles, their ideas. They're willing to give up their very lives in order to win. And then if they do such, they can succeed and become the masters. And I think politics is a lot like this, you know. And I think that, you know, some libertarians could learn from this and learn that really all movements that have ever been successful have done this. They have risked everything for success, and libertarians are not willing to do that. They are not willing to risk principles. They are not willing to risk their lives. They're not willing to risk, you know, their purity tests, and for that they'll never succeed. I think. I kind of wanted to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of libertarians, their identity has become, you know, their political persona. I think it is amplified when there's a lot of libertarians that they think that their closest circle of friends is, you know, their little Twitter bros or you know, the Facebook group or whatever like that. And, you know, it's better than having no one. I'm not trying to diminish what, you know, online friendships can be, but the problem is though is that when you're a lot of your best quality social interactions come from the movement, then it's difficult. You know, you don't want to go outside the movement, right? You know, like it's you know, that is what, you know, it is your libertarian ideology that you take the greatest amount of pride in, and so it's natural to want to protect that.
Yeah.
And so you become very, very sensitive to friendly fire from, you know, we always treat heretics and penalize disloyalty, right, more than any other sin out there, right? And so that's also, I think, why you end up having, you know, what the libertarian movement is a history of very epic personality battles.
Yeah.
That often you know, we already attract a certain sort of quirky individual more than others. You combine that, and so you always have this dynamic where you know, what might begin as a substantial, honest, intellectual disagreement, you know, ends up becoming a multi-decade long hate campaign, you know, from different camps. Murray Rothbard's biography might be have a few of those within it, and so yeah, there is that dynamic there where you know it's all about protecting, you know, your brand, your tribe, your online community,
Yeah.
where and so you become more interested in kind of the defending this theoretical thought experiment sort of aspect to it, rather than engaging in your own community as a flesh and blood individual, engaging with your neighbors and trying to identify common ground with, you know, the boomer Republican down the street, or you know, whatever. And I think that, you know, again, if you're a young libertarian out there and you're trying to figure out how can you improve your influence within your community, for example, one of the easiest ways to do it would be, you know, put down the Rothbard for a month. They'll go back to it afterwards, right?
Yeah, of course.
But put down the Rothbard for a month and read your local history.
Hmm.
You know, go to the local library and, you know, find a few you know, find the father of your little downtown area and go read about a story. You
Yeah.
know, and because then what you're doing is you're now building, you know, an intellectual, you know, you can actually apply sort of the lessons for reading history, so the lessons of social studies, and you know, all this framework that you've done as a good libertarian. You can now jump out of this theoretical world, jump into your own community, and you can do your own work.
Yeah.
You know, and chances are very few people do this, and it's always, particularly the younger you are, you know, you always have this dynamic where, you know, the little old ladies and the old grandpas always love, oh, you know, junior, like, you know, it's always great to see a young person, you know, and you know, that dynamic is working in your favor, and all of a sudden, you know, you can start using talking about cool local history stories as a way of building up your social capital within your community, which raises your influence in your community,
Hmm.
which now gives you the opportunity to then express your ideas from your libertarian perspective on broader things, because now people have some reason to think you're interesting, that does require you being a libertarian, right?
Yeah.
And so there's all these little things where, again, I understand why, you know, again, I remember the peak of the Ron Paul days, and you have 2,000 friends on Facebook that, you know, all are on the liberty movement, and you know,
Yeah.
I get that sense of community and camaraderie, and there's a lot of great people you meet along the way, and all that is not, none of this is bad, but it can't be the only thing. And I think for a lot of libertarians, it does become too much, and again, nothing wrong with that. Plenty of people doing it before, no reason to beat yourself up over it. You know,
Yeah.
no scolding here. I just, you know, it's always recognize that there's some healthier behaviors that you might be able to engage in going forward.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good note to end on. I think we talked about a lot of good things, and I think, you know, I think strategy is becoming more and more important for libertarianism, especially as, you know, there's a bit of a movement now brewing to care about that more. Um, my last guest, Pete Quinones, you know, that's all we talked about is the move towards strategy. So I really do appreciate you coming on and talking about that. I think we got a lot of covered a lot of ground. I think there's a lot of things that people should really, you know, think on, that we both discussed. And yeah, I appreciate you being on.
Thanks for
If
having
there's
me.
anything you want to plug, feel free to plug it now.
Yeah. You know, if you do not have a copy of Economics in One Lesson, you should go to Mises.org/one lesson, and you'll get
Hmm.
a free copy. You know, we can cover shipping and handling.
Yep.
I'm trying to think of anything too big in Mises.org on your Austro-libertarian needs. Um, and you know, Rothbard report. I've got some of the old '90s Rothbard articles over there. I need to publish some new ones over that. And I think later this week I'm going to be relaunching the Redneck Riviera podcast with my
All
buddy
right.
Ford Suze, where we'll be talking about politics and religion from a panhandle politics perspective. You know, hopefully they'll become regular. We've got 3 libertarian events this past 3 weeks, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of interest in it. So see if we can get a regular
Yeah,
schedule after that.
great. And on the economics in one lesson, I have a box of those from the Mises Institute in my car.
There you go.
I give it to one copy every time somebody gets in my car, so that's a small little thing you can do to help spread libertarianism. Is just get one of those packs and give it out to people you know.
We've given away, I think, over 70,000 already.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for being on, though, and have a wonderful day.
Excellent. Thank you, Peyton.
Yeah, no problem.